You know what's wild? Someone lights up today, and nothing about it feels historical. But that cloud of smoke connects modern life to a very ancient human story. Humans have always tested strange plants. Some fed us, while others changed how we felt. So here's the big question. When did people first discover cannabis smoke? Was it an accident, a medical experiment, or something planned for an ancient ceremony? Stories give us dramatic answers, but archaeology forces us to be much more careful. Cannabis was used for rope and food long before anyone proved it was smoked. And that's important, because growing cannabis does not automatically mean people inhaled it. Ancient pollen, fibers, and seeds prove the plant existed, but smoke needs stronger evidence. Smoke disappears quickly, while burned residue can survive and reveal its chemistry thousands later. Researchers need dates, repeated patterns, chemical traces, and a clear archaeological setting. One burned seed could be cooking, and one loose leaf could mean almost nothing. But repeated burners inside graves, filled with strong compounds, begin telling a real story. And that trail does not begin in a palace. It begins high in the mountains. The Pamir Mountains were cold, remote, and crossed by traders from many different cultures. Along those routes traveled goods, beliefs, burial customs, and perhaps powerful plant knowledge. The answer was waiting inside black residue, wooden braziers, and graves forgotten for centuries. But first, we need to understand that cannabis has several completely different histories. It could feed people, clothe them, heal them, or change their state of mind. Only that final use answers our question, and direct evidence appears surprisingly late. Cannabis grows across many environments, and different conditions can change the plant's chemistry. Some plants grew tall with useful fibers, while others became shorter and more resinous. Early farmers saved whatever worked best, slowly changing the plant over many generations. Today, genetic studies compare cultivated cannabis with wild-looking relatives to trace that process. One major study places early domestication in East Asia during the first farming communities. That history may reach back around 12,000 years, but here's the important warning. Domestication proves cultivation. It does not prove that those farmers were trying to get high. The earliest benefits were probably practical. Strong stem fibers and nutritious, oily seeds. Those fibers became ropes, fishing nets, woven cloth, and materials that helped people survive. The seeds stored easily, traveled well, and gave families another useful source of food. Once a crop became useful, people protected it, traded it, and carried it into new places. And every new climate changed the plant, while every new culture preferred something different. In high mountains, stronger sunlight and stress may have encouraged more protective plant compounds. Ancient growers could not measure THC, but they could remember how different plants affected people. You do not need a laboratory for that. You only need memory and repeated experience. Trade carried seeds, migration carried skills, and marriage carried customs between distant communities. Cannabis became familiar across Eurasia, but familiar plants were not always used the same way. Some people wove it, some ate it, some made medicines, and some pursued altered states. Archaeology must separate those purposes, or every ancient seed becomes false evidence of smoking. For our mystery, we need burning, psychoactive chemistry, repeated use, and a meaningful setting. Now imagine an early farming village where cold mornings, weak ropes, and hunger were normal. Then a tall, useful plant appears, producing strong stems and baskets full of seeds. Nobody needed to feel intoxicated to value it. A strong rope could save a life. A good fishing net could feed a camp, while woven sails moved heavy cargo. So cannabis probably traveled first because it worked, not because it changed consciousness. But eventually, someone noticed certain plants smelled sharper and carried much thicker resin. Maybe animals reacted, healers experimented, or unusual smoke drifted across a campfire. Those ideas are possible, but possible is not the same thing as proven. Fire changed everything humans touched, including food, medicine, fragrance, and the air they breathed. Every campfire became a rough chemical laboratory, changing plant compounds through heat. Most smoke irritated people, but some smoke may have soothed, confused, or fascinated them. A curious group would probably remember the plant that created the strangest reaction. The next time, they might add more, choose a different part, or heat it differently. That is how simple experiments become traditions, even without written instructions or modern science. Still, prehistoric experiments rarely leave clear evidence that archaeologists can confidently identify. Smoke vanishes, containers rot, camps move, and memories disappear when people die. That is why the first discovery may be much older than the first surviving proof. And this gap between what happened and what survived is the heart of the mystery. Humans probably found psychoactive cannabis earlier, but we cannot honestly give that moment a date. So instead of inventing a first smoker, we follow the oldest evidence we can test. Could the first cannabis high have happened by accident? Honestly, that is completely possible. Picture a cold evening, with Aru gathering wood while Nara carries mixed plants. One bundle falls into the fire, and suddenly the smoke smells completely different. People laugh longer, feel lighter, and stare at patterns moving inside the smoke. When winter returns, they search for that same plant, turning accident into a method. It is a believable story, but we have to admit that it is still a story. Good history uses imagination to explain possibilities, while evidence decides what we can claim. Medicine offers another possible path, because healers constantly tested plants on pain and sickness. A plant might ease pain, increase appetite, deepen sleep, or produce unusually vivid dreams. Repeated medical use could reveal intoxication, and ritual specialists might then adopt the effect. Trade offers another path, with travelers bringing stronger resin and unfamiliar customs into mountain communities. The Pamirs sat near major crossroads, so people, objects, and knowledge moved constantly. Human remains and foreign objects show that this cemetery belonged to a connected world. Connected worlds spread useful plants, successful rituals, and prestigious customs much faster. The stronger cannabis may have arrived through trade or grown naturally in harsh mountains. Researchers cannot choose between those possibilities because the residue shows use, not origin. And that honesty matters. History has gaps, and a strong documentary does not hide them. We cannot name the first person, the first village, or the first accidental inhale. But by around 500 BCE, people were deliberately burning psychoactive cannabis during ceremonies. Now we can finally enter Jirzankal, where ancient smoke becomes testable historical evidence. Jirzankal sits high in the Pamirs, surrounded by thin air and enormous mountains. Dark and pale stones formed rings that marked ancient burial places across the ground. During excavation, archaeologists carefully uncovered fragile wooden objects beneath the packed soil. Wood usually disappears, but these dry conditions preserved blackened surfaces and hidden chemical clues. Then more graves revealed more braziers, with similar shapes and similar burning marks. That repetition suggested a shared custom, not random household waste or one strange accident. Some braziers held heated stones, allowing plant material to release vapor without direct flames. There were no rolled joints, clay pipes, or anything resembling a modern smoking device. Ancient smoking often meant breathing a shared cloud that filled the space around everyone. So when we say smoking, we really mean collective inhalation from a heated brazier. Researchers scraped tiny residue samples and examined them with modern chemical instruments. One important signal was cannabinol, a compound that can form as THC breaks down. High levels suggested cannabis with more psychoactive potential than ordinary low-THC wild plants. The residue also showed burning, proving the plant was heated rather than simply stored nearby. And it happened inside repeated graves, surrounded by the clear setting of funeral ceremonies. That combination gives us direct evidence: dated burials, burned cannabis, potency, and repeated use. Around 500 BCE, people here inhaled psychoactive cannabis vapor during funerary rituals. This remains among the earliest directly dated evidence for deliberate cannabis smoking. Notice the wording, among the earliest, because future discoveries could push the date backward. For now, Jirzankal gives the strongest anchor for answering our original question. But the chemistry solved one mystery and created another. Where did that potency come from? Wild cannabis varies naturally from one valley, slope, season, and climate to another. Strong mountain sunlight may encourage protective compounds that help the plant handle environmental stress. So high valleys could produce unusually potent cannabis without anyone deliberately breeding it. But humans also select what works, return to good patches, and trade their favorites. The strongest plants may therefore reflect nature, human choice, or both working together. The study cannot prove ancient breeding, but it does show that psychoactive material was chosen. And that choice looks intentional, because many other fragrant plants were easier to find. If people only wanted incense, local shrubs and juniper could have done the job. The likely goal was altered consciousness, perhaps connected with mourning or contact with spirits. Archaeologists also found musical instruments, suggesting these funerals may have included powerful sound. Smoke changes perception, music shapes emotion, and grief makes every sensation feel more intense. Cannabis may have helped the whole community share one unusual experience around death, but we cannot interview those mourners, so their exact beliefs disappeared with them. Artifacts show actions, while context suggests purpose, but meaning must still be reconstructed carefully. What seems clear is that cannabis was heated and people breathed the surrounding vapor. This was not a roadside party or casual entertainment. Death framed the entire event. Our earliest clear evidence therefore looks sacred, collective, controlled, and deeply solemn. Many early intoxicant traditions began inside rituals where elders controlled access and setting. From there, similar smoke customs spread across the steppe and entered written history. Farther east, another grave preserved something even more visually dramatic: actual cannabis plants. The dry air at Yanghai kept leaves, seeds, and flowering material recognizable for centuries. Beside one body, archaeologists discovered a large cache weighing close to 800 grams. This was not pollen or invisible residue. It was a deliberately stored bundle of cannabis. The burial dates to roughly 27 centuries ago, slightly earlier than Jirzankal. Objects beside the deceased suggested status, and researchers proposed he may have been a ritual specialist. Chemical and genetic testing showed the plant still carried signs linked with THC production. The bundle contained flowering parts and resin glands, not ordinary waste from making rope. That strongly suggests psychoactive or medicinal use rather than simple textile production. But here is the problem. Archaeologists did not find a clear smoking device. It may have been burned, brewed, used as medicine, or placed there as an offering. Yanghai proves possession, selection, and likely potency, but not the exact method of use. Jirzankal proves burning, while Yanghai preserves the plant itself. Together, they strengthen the story. These communities knew cannabis well, valued the flowers, stored large amounts, and buried specialists with it. That knowledge existed before Herodotus wrote his famous description of steppe cannabis rituals. Archaeology can support old texts, but it can also show where those texts are incomplete. Writers usually described outsiders, while graves preserve the choices of local people themselves. Neither source tells us everything, but together, they create a much deeper picture. Next, we meet the Scythians, whose funeral smoke became famous in Greek history. A Greek historian recorded their practice, and his words survived for about 24 centuries. The Scythians were mobile steppe riders, skilled archers, and a serious threat to empires. They moved with their herds, carried portable homes, and spread customs across huge distances. Herodotus described their royal funerals, long processions, and intense acts of mourning. After the burial, they built small wooden frames and covered them with thick felt. They placed red-hot stones inside, then threw hemp material onto the heat. Dense vapor filled the tent, and Herodotus said the Scythians shouted with joy. It sounds a lot like a communal hotbox, built without pipes and powered by stones. But translation matters, because ancient words for seeds and plant material can be unclear. Seeds contain little psychoactive resin, while flowering parts carry much more of it. Herodotus wrote as an outsider, possibly using travelers' reports rather than direct observation. Still, steppe burials have produced frames, vessels, and plant remains that match his description. So written history and physical evidence both point toward shared cannabis vapor rituals. And once again, the setting follows a funeral, with death, cleansing, and smoke together. Perhaps the vapor purified mourners, softened grief, invited spirits, or simply relaxed the body. The exact meaning remains debated, but the basic physical action is much clearer. By Herodotus's time, the practice was famous enough to be described to foreign readers. That suggests similar traditions traveled across Central Eurasia, with mobile communities. Jirzankal lay farther east, while Scythian lands stretched west across enormous trade routes. The earliest smokers may therefore belong to a broad network, not one single tribe. Cannabis inhalation may have developed gradually among connected cultures sharing potent plants and rituals. Far to the southwest, another surprise appeared inside a small shrine at Tel Arad. Two stone altars still carried dark residues that had survived for thousands of years. Testing showed frankincense on one altar and cannabis on the other, in different mixtures. The cannabis was mixed with animal dung, which sounds strange until you understand the heating. Dung burns slowly at lower temperatures, helping cannabinoids evaporate instead of burning instantly. That mixture suggests deliberate control over temperature, release, and the experience inside the shrine. The shrine dates to the 8th century BCE, making it earlier than Jirzankal, so why not simply call Tel Arad the first? Because the evidence categories differ. Still, the residue strongly indicates psychoactive cannabis was burned during ritual worship. It also shows cannabis ceremonies had reached the southern Levant by the Iron Age. The resin probably arrived through trade, because cannabis was not a common local crop. That means valuable material traveled far, and priests considered the ritual worth the cost. Again, there was no joint or pipe. The sacred room itself filled with vapor. Ancient smoking technology often meant heating a substance and breathing the surrounding air. The method looks similar to incense, but psychoactive chemistry changes what the smoke could do. Inside worship, altered perception may have become part of the sacred experience. We should not force modern party culture onto ancient people with completely different meanings. At Jirzankal, cannabis framed funerals. At Tel Arad, it framed worship. Different societies used the same plant in different ceremonies with similar inhalation methods. By now, the evidence looks less accidental and much more carefully engineered. Travel farther south into India, and the history changes because drinks become more important than smoke. Ancient texts mention bhanga, although scholars still debate the exact plant and date. Many historians connect it with cannabis, but a careful documentary should mention the uncertainty. Later traditions clearly used cannabis preparations in medicine and religious celebration. Bhang was made by grinding leaves, adding spices, and mixing everything into milk. No smoke was needed, because the effect arrived through digestion and developed more slowly. Different chemistry created different timing, and culture built different rituals around that experience. Cannabis also entered healing traditions for pain, appetite, digestion, and many other complaints. Those claims mixed observation, symbolism, and tradition, not modern controlled medical trials. So historical use does not automatically prove every old medical claim is scientifically correct. Still, long use shows detailed knowledge of ingredients, preparation, and serving size. Festival settings also controlled who prepared the drink, when it was served, and why. Sacred stories later connected cannabis with protection, release, and divine associations. Some of those traditions survived for centuries and still appear in modern festivals. India reminds us that getting high has never required smoking anything at all. Our title is therefore simpler than the bigger question of cannabis intoxication. Direct evidence gives us Pamir braziers, Tel Arad altars, and stored flowers at Yanghai. Texts from India and Greece add more pathways and more cultural meanings. No single birthplace can be proven, because different regions developed different cannabis traditions. As the plant traveled, methods changed, meanings multiplied, and the story became global. Greek writers knew the word cannabis, and Herodotus used it when describing the Scythians. Later, Dioscorides included cannabis among hundreds of plants in his medical catalog. He discussed fibers, seeds, and plant juices, although the listed uses were limited. Roman writers also mentioned hemp, mainly through farming, materials, and medical observations. That does not look like a widespread smoking culture. Fiber and medicine dominate the evidence. And this teaches us something important. Knowledge can spread without identical habits spreading too. Greeks recorded Scythian vapor tents, but ordinary Greek households did not widely copy them. Wine already dominated social life. Other medicines existed, and cultures resist unfamiliar customs. Availability mattered too, because compact resin traveled better than bulky flowers that could spoil. That helps explain why concentrated hashish later moved so effectively along trade routes. Medical texts preserved cannabis knowledge as copyists repeated plant entries for centuries. But written knowledge can survive long after a treatment becomes rare or disappears. A text proves awareness and possible use. It does not prove that everyone used it. One sentence in one scroll can never represent an entire civilization's daily life. This is why dramatic claims about cannabis in Egyptian mummies need serious caution. The evidence is disputed, so this script avoids pretending that pharaohs definitely smoked cannabis. Reliable storytelling sometimes means removing exciting errors instead of repeating them for views. The verified truth is already amazing. Ancient people mastered many different cannabis technologies. They used stones, altars, tents, drinks, medicines, food, and fiber instead of modern glass pipes. Human creativity transformed one adaptable plant from a practical crop into an intoxicating ritual tool. As centuries passed, concentrated resin became portable, popular, and deeply controversial. Across parts of the Islamic world, debates around cannabis and hashish became increasingly serious. The Quran does not name cannabis directly, so later jurists reasoned from broader rules on intoxication. Some condemned hashish, some treated medicine differently, and opinions varied between regions. There was never one timeless response shared by every Muslim society and every scholar. Hashish was often eaten as paste, while pipe smoking spread more widely after tobacco. Before common pipes, people swallowed preparations, mixed resin into food, or inhaled heated vapor. Some sources connect cannabis with Sufi groups, but polemics and legends often distort the picture. Opponents attacked it, users wrote poetry, authorities issued bans, and markets continued selling it. Cannabis also became a social label, connected with certain classes, professions, and outsiders. That social fear later influenced prohibition, because drugs often become symbols of feared people. At the same time, physicians and pharmacists continued recording preparations and adjusting doses. The same plant therefore lived several lives: medicine, pleasure, devotion, and political control. Trade carried hashish across North Africa, West Asia, and toward Mediterranean ports. Europe knew hemp well through ropes and sails, but cannabis intoxication remained less common. Then French forces entered Egypt and met a living, visible culture of hashish use. This was not Europe's first contact, but it dramatically increased fascination and public attention. Scientists, writers, doctors, and curious patients all began experimenting with cannabis preparations. An ancient ritual plant entered laboratories and fashionable salons under completely new meanings. The story is no longer ancient, but it explains how Europe remembered cannabis. In 1798, French forces invaded Egypt and encountered hashish across local markets and communities. Soldiers explored these customs, while military authorities quickly worried about discipline and control. The popular story says Napoleon personally banned hashish, and everyone immediately obeyed him. Reality was messier. Local orders appeared, enforcement varied, and people continued using it. Decades later, the French doctor Jacques-Joseph Moreau studied hashish and altered mental states. He experimented on himself, observed others, and compared intoxication with symptoms of mental illness. Parisian writers and artists also gathered in elegant rooms to eat a cannabis paste called dawamesk. Their hashish club became legendary, with members describing beautiful visions and unpleasant excesses. They were mostly eating cannabis, not smoking it, so the effects arrived slowly and unpredictably. Meanwhile in India, William O'Shaughnessy studied cannabis preparations during British colonial service. He recorded doses, treated serious convulsions, reported results, and drew attention from European doctors. Cannabis extracts entered pharmacy bottles, although doctors found that results could vary widely. Standardization was difficult because plants, preparations, and final doses were never exactly the same. As newer medicines appeared, especially injectable drugs, medical cannabis gradually lost popularity. But Europe's cultural memory had changed, linking cannabis more strongly with intoxication and exotic imagery. Old Asian practices were reframed through colonial science, travel writing, and fashionable literature. That process sometimes erased local expertise, while Europeans claimed they had discovered everything themselves. History should give credit clearly, because local knowledge existed long before European laboratories. By modern times, smoking became the famous image, even though ancient methods were far broader. So let's rewind once more and answer the question without myths or exaggeration. The internet loves the dramatic claim that humans smoked cannabis 12,000 years ago. But that date comes from domestication evidence, not direct proof of psychoactive smoking. Another popular claim says cannabis on mummies proves ancient Egyptian pharaohs were getting high. That evidence remains disputed, so it cannot carry the weight people often place on it. Another story credits the legendary Shen Nong with prescribing cannabis thousands of years earlier. Older traditions may survive orally, but historians must date the manuscripts that actually remain. That does not dismiss ancient Chinese medicine. It simply separates legend from surviving evidence. Another mistake treats every piece of ancient hemp as proof of a psychoactive drug culture. Rope fragments prove fiber use, but they do not prove that anyone got high. Seeds might have been food, oil, planting stock, medicine, or something else entirely. Context decides meaning, and the strongest cases combine burning, potency, repetition, and ritual placement. A great documentary separates facts from possibilities, possibilities from myths, and myths from nonsense. That careful approach does not weaken the wonder. It makes the wonder much more trustworthy. The strongest direct answer remains ritual cannabis inhalation in the Pamirs, about 25 centuries ago. Tel Arad may be several centuries earlier and shows cannabis resin burned on a sacred altar. Yanghai adds potent cannabis flowers from around 27 centuries ago, but not a known method. Herodotus adds a written account of Scythian vapor tents from classical antiquity. India adds ancient sacred drinks, while Greece and Rome add medicine and practical hemp. Together, those pieces create a mosaic, because no single source tells the entire story. Now we can finally give a clear, honest, memorable, and fully sourced answer. So when exactly did humans first smoke psychoactive cannabis? Here is the honest truth. We do not know the first moment, because smoke disappears and prehistory keeps secrets. People may have discovered the effects earlier through fire, healing, or simple plant experiments, but direct evidence clearly appears during the first millennium before the Common Era. At Jirzankal, around 500 BCE, potent cannabis was burned inside funeral braziers. At Tel Arad, several centuries earlier, cannabis resin was burned on a sacred altar. At Yanghai, around 27 centuries ago, potent flowers were placed inside a grave. Herodotus later described Scythians heating hemp on stones inside enclosed felt tents. So ancient communities definitely pursued cannabis intoxication at least several thousand years ago. They used braziers, altars, tents, drinks, medicines, and foods in different settings. They rarely used anything resembling a modern joint, so that popular image is misleading. The oldest story is not casual rebellion. It is mourning, worship, healing, and community. Cannabis entered serious human spaces where people faced death, pain, mystery, and the unknown. Later came pleasure, poetry, legal debate, stigma, scientific study, and commercial trade. One adaptable plant collected many meanings as every culture reshaped what cannabis became. That flexibility may explain its survival. Useful fiber, useful seeds, and powerful chemistry. It became medicine, ritual, pleasure for some, and danger in the eyes of others. History cannot settle today's laws, but it destroys the myth of a modern invention. Cannabis intoxication is deeply ancient, with direct inhalation evidence reaching about 25 centuries. Future discoveries may push the date earlier, but until then, the evidence leads us here.